The Jacobin dictatorship established in France in the 1790s marked, in many ways, a second French Revolution. Violence, war, and sharp factional divides had significantly transformed the aspirations and ideals first announced in 1789 as France became a republic. Further afield, the revolution was also serving to radically transform other parts of French society as well, and this was especially true of the overseas territories. Although a European state, France also possessed a global colonial empire that was hardly immune to the events convulsing the mother country. This was evident in the French Atlantic world in the Antilles, where the impact of the revolutionary turmoil was felt almost from the beginning. Of these colonial possessions, it would be the island of Saint-Domingue that would prove the most significant. Saint-Domingue was one of France's most profitable New World colonies. It was referred to commonly as the Pearl of the Antilles, and for good reason. The island was a vital center of colonial trade, and a primary producer of sugar, one of the most important and lucrative colonial commodities in the 18th century. The production of sugar was a labor-intensive process. Growing sugarcane required large plantations, and harvesting the crop was dependent upon an extensive labor force, one that was provided by slaves brought to the New World through the slave trade. On Saint-Domingue, the majority of the population, some 90%, was enslaved. Under these circumstances, race and social status were closely connected in the colonial world of the Americas. Wealthy plantation owners were the most powerful men in colonial Atlantic society, making up a plantocracy typically referred to as the Grand Blanc on the island. In addition to this class of colonial planters, white farmers and workers, so-called Petits Blancs, had come to Saint-Domingue from Europe in search of fortune and new opportunities. Unlike the planter oligarchy, the Petits Blancs were not wealthy landowners and often found employment on the large plantations, taking jobs as skilled laborers and slave drivers. Inspired by dreams of enriching themselves through the profitable colonial trade, the Petits Blancs never fully accepted their dependency on wealthy plantation owners. They aspired to be independent landowners themselves. In fact, many Petits Blancs harbored resentment against their social betters and the aristocratic planter class that dominated colonial society. Despite these divisions that ran through white society, the colonists did have a common point of interest when it came to life on the island. They were adamant about ensuring that the racial boundaries that governed the Atlantic world remained in place, and this was especially important when it came to a third group of individuals, the mixed Afro-Europeans, collectively known as the gens de couleur. The gens de couleur were the product of racial mixing that had occurred on the island over centuries. They possessed white European fathers, but were nonetheless distinct through their African ancestry, in some cases being born from native mothers. On the eve of the revolution, the gens de couleur were roughly equal in number to the white population on the island of Saint-Domingue. But that was not the most troubling factor. Gens de couleur were not treated as slaves. They were unquestionably free men, and in certain cases, owned slaves of their own. Some of them were among the most wealthy plantation owners on the island. Yet, due to their status as men of color, there were nonetheless certain legal restrictions placed upon them. Gens de couleur were forbidden from participating in colonial politics, nor could they take up arms in the local militias. Association between whites and the gens de couleur was strongly discouraged. In short, the gens de couleur were a group unto themselves, neither native nor wholly accepted as equals by the European colonists. These factors entailed that Atlantic society was characterized by a high degree of diversity and legal pluralism, with different laws and privileges belonging to different social groups. While this was not uncommon for societies in Europe at the time, one feature did make Atlantic society unique. Race, rather than social standing, was the basis for the social hierarchies and legal regimes that governed the colonies. This aspect made it unquestionably distinct when compared to old regime Europe. Although slavery was the backbone of the colonial economy, by the 18th century, this was being called into question by a growing number of elites on both sides of the Atlantic. With the Enlightenment, new perspectives on slavery and human bondage had begun to influence public opinion. Drawing upon the notions of liberty and equality popularized by philosophers, reformers took up the cause of abolitionism and used Enlightenment principles to question the theoretical and moral foundations of human bondage. Abolitionists and Enlightenment thinkers denounced slavery as immoral. As they argued, slavery violated the very idea of natural rights and used brutal methods of torture at odds with Europe's civilized and liberal values. Abolitionist organizations such as the Society of the Friends of Blacks, founded in 1788, had begun to form in France, Britain, and other European countries by the late 18th century, revealing a growing consensus among certain elites that slavery ran counter to the liberties that all men should theoretically be free to enjoy. Over time, these views became increasingly forceful in their demands, signaling a growing desire on the part of Enlightenment elites to end the slave trade and even the institutions that supported human slavery. It was evident that prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution, questions regarding race, liberty, and the morality of slavery were already being discussed in both Europe and its colonies. Yet with the outbreak of revolution in the British colonies and France, these issues became increasingly radicalized. As calls for liberty and equality echoed across two hemispheres, questions arose as to whether these principles should be applied to colonial societies, and in what measure. When news that Louis XVI was going to be calling the Estates General became known in late 1788, various colonial landowners hoped to have their interests represented in the body as well. Many of the large plantation owners lived in France rather than the distant colonies, and they believed that the calling of the Estates General, after more than a century, would provide them with an opportunity to address issues relevant to French colonial policies. To this end, absentee plantation owners residing in France began forming committees intended to represent colonial interests before the king. Colonists living on the island followed suit shortly after, with the Petits Blancs also hoping to have their particular grievances addressed. Together, these different committees and bodies began drafting a number of petitions to present to the Estates General, suggesting how best to reform French colonial society as the delegates prepared to meet. Colonial interests proved willing to endorse reform, and there was one issue in particular that both planters and colonists could agree upon. That was the question of greater autonomy. They desired to empower the local colonial assemblies with more authority, in essence, calling for greater self-government and control over laws and taxation at home. For many colonial elites, it was believed that this demand could be furthered by influencing deputies in Paris and presenting the colonial cause in moderately liberal terms. Colonial liberties could be blended with the general call for representative government and freedom advanced by delegates, it was wagered. ensuring greater independence from the mother country some 3,000 miles away. However, in August 1789, colonial plantation owners were given a shock when the National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It was uncertain what this declaration meant for the colonies. If all men had natural rights, as the document claimed, did this include slaves? More pointedly, did the government intend to abolish slavery? Unwilling to endorse such a radical platform, plantation owners organized a lobby group in Paris, the so-called Club Massaic, intended to represent colonial interests in the National Assembly and apply pressure on politicians to ensure that abolitionism was thwarted. In framing their arguments, colonial lobbyists argued that Saint-Domingue was distinct from France. Its needs and interests were different from those of the mother country, they insisted, and therefore it should neither be governed directly by the mother country nor subject to all its laws. In making this argument, supporters claimed that colonists familiar with the needs of Atlantic society should be the ones to write a constitution for Saint-Domingue, not French politicians sitting in Paris. Simply put, it was the colonial assemblies who knew what was best for the colony, and therefore it was the colonial assemblies who should make the laws. While the Atlantic colonies remained attached to France, liberty required that they be free to attend to their own local affairs and draft their own laws as they saw fit. Naturally, not everyone saw things this way. This was especially true of the gens de couleur. For them, the revolution in Paris presented a new window of opportunity. Long excluded from politics and treated as second-class citizens, the gens de couleur were bent on making a different argument. Saint-Domingue was part of the French nation, they claimed. As a part of France, the laws of the mother country should unquestionably be applied to the colony. Taking up this line of argument was Julien Raymond, an indigo planter and gens de couleur from Saint-Domingue, who was a strong advocate for racial reform. During the summer of 1789, Raymond went between Versailles and Paris, meeting with influential politicians. In trying to convince delegates of his ideas, he went as far as to claim that he was an official delegate for the island's gens de couleur population. In Paris, Raymond met with other gens de couleur activists and formed an alliance with abolitionist groups. Their policy was simple. They sought to challenge the racial laws that discriminated against gens de couleur and free blacks, regardless of their wealth or social status. These reform-minded advocates were not calling for the abolition of slavery, as many of them were slave owners themselves. What they did argue, however, was that numerous gens de couleur fulfilled the qualification for active citizenship, as laid out under the new laws prescribed for the nation. They were property owners and could pay the required poll tax necessary for holding political rights. According to the Declaration of Rights, they should be entitled to vote and hold office like any other citizen of the nation. In seeking out allies, Raymond approached one Henri Grégoire, a Catholic official who in 1789 threw his support behind the Third Estate. Grégoire had made a name for himself as an outspoken champion of France's Jewish populations. In pamphlets and speeches, he had argued in favor of Jewish emancipation, appealing to principles of equal rights and religious tolerance. Raymond wanted to know if Grégoire might do the same for the gens de couleur, and Grégoire agreed. Yet Grégoire proved more radical than Raymond anticipated. In a series of speeches, he not only supported rights for the gens de couleur, he went as far as to question the basis of slavery. He even suggested that the revolution and slavery could not coexist. Natural rights implied that no man should be a slave, in Grégoire's opinion. This radical declaration confirmed what white colonists suspected all along, that attacks against racism were attacks against slavery altogether, and this was something that would not and could not be tolerated. To lay this matter to rest, the Club Masséac began applying stronger pressure on the government, and politicians responded. In March of 1790, a decree issued by the National Assembly stated that French laws would not unconditionally be applied to the Atlantic colonies. Legislative power was placed in the hands of Saint-Domingue's newly formed colonial assembly, which happened to be dominated by whites. Upon hearing of this decision, the colonial assembly sitting in Saint-Domingue immediately began demanding that discriminatory legislation be put into effect to ensure that citizenship was given to whites alone, effectively making the question of citizenship and political rights a racial issue. The gens de couleur balked at this sudden turn of events. Among them was Vincent O'shea, a gens de couleur activist who had been with Raymond in Paris. Born to French parents in Saint-Domingue, O'shea was among one of the wealthiest business owners in Saint-Domingue. He had been educated in France, where his parents had sent him to complete his university studies. As a prosperous and educated gens de couleur, O'shea had come to Paris in the hopes of convincing the National Assembly to change the racial laws that govern the island. The National Assembly's decision in 1790, favoring the planters, convinced O'shea that he could expect nothing from Paris. And so, learning of the verdict, he returned back to Saint-Domingue, determined to press his cause directly before the colonial assembly. As expected, the colonial governor ignored O'shea. With this rebuff, O'shea decided the time had come for a more forceful policy. In response, he organized a militia and threatened to use force of arms if necessary to obtain his goals. When the colonial authorities learned of this attempted assault on the colonial government, it was evident something had to be done. How long would it be before disorderly gens de couleur inspired slaves to do the same thing, turning slave against master, they wondered. O'shea had to be stopped before this situation occurred. And so in February of 1791, his militiamen were rounded up and O'shea imprisoned. Intending to make an example of him, the governor sentenced O'shea to death by public beating, sending a clear warning to anyone who might try and mimic his rebellious behavior. While O'Shea's rebellion may have been a failure, violent suppression did nothing to temper the anger of the gens de couleur. In fact, the brutal execution of O'Shea in public only served to inflame tensions further, prompting the gens de couleur to become more radical in their demands. Protests quickly broke out in all the major cities of the colony, and the colonial government did not hesitate to suppress them mercilessly. In the midst of these struggles coming to divide the colony, other events were beginning to take shape. As battles between colonists and the gens de couleur destabilized society, the worst fears of plantation owners were soon realized. In August 1791, slave revolts began to break out on the northern part of the island. Realizing their white masters were busy combating gens de couleur protests, slaves used the moment as an opportunity to secure their own liberation. Banding together, slaves set fire to plantations and formed makeshift armies with other slaves from neighboring plantations. More frightening still was the fact that certain radical leaders began lending assistance to these revolts and adopting the rhetoric of the French Revolution to encourage resistance. They drafted petitions speaking of the rights of all men and condemned the immorality of slavery as an institution, transforming slave insurrections into a revolutionary movement. By 1792, Saint-Domingue was embroiled in its own revolution, as slaves and gens de couleur challenged the ruling hierarchy of the white plantation owners. Yet this growing unrest also fundamentally transformed colonial society as well. Prior to 1789, colonial society had been diverse. Different degrees of African ancestry often implied different levels of status and different degrees of social inclusion. Slaves were not free blacks, just as gens de couleur were not labeled as noirs or nègres. Revolt was coming to dramatically change this. Attempts to constrain gens de couleur and preserve the institution of slavery had brought existing racial tensions to the surface. A violent racial hostility now spilled over, creating polarizing identities. The sides in this conflict organized around stark terms of black and white, as politics divided along racial lines. Whereas in France, society had split between those who supported the revolution and those who opposed it, in Saint-Domingue, these political struggles were dramatically reoriented. Slaves and men of color took up the rhetoric of emancipation and equality, holding up the ideals of the French Revolution as a direct challenge to the unjust principles which governed a white colonial oligarchy. The slave uprisings corresponded with the radicalization of the revolution in France proper. By 1792, the Jacobins had seized control of the government in France, adding new uncertainties regarding how the metropolitan government would address the evolving situation overseas. Robespierre had already made a name for himself, criticizing the National Assembly for condoning slavery on French soil. Unlike various moderate deputies, he did not believe that institutionalized slavery should or could be tolerated by a liberated French nation. In his opinion, the principles of the revolution should not be debased to preserve the imperial economy. Sacrifice the colonies rather than the principle, he railed, echoing a familiar refrain among abolitionists and radicals. If there was to be a French empire, it was to be an empire of liberty rather than one based upon brute force and oppression. With the Jacobin ascension to power, the situation in Saint-Domingue became ever more precarious. At home, radicals were pursuing a program of violent democratic reform vested in ideals of legal and political equality. It was not a stretch of the imagination to believe that they would legally emancipate slaves as well under the banner of equality. In response, horrified plantation owners stepped up efforts to crush the slave rebellions by any means necessary before this could be realized. Adding to this chaos, Britain and Spain had begun to take an interest in the events transpiring across the French Atlantic. Throughout the 18th century, these two powers had traditionally competed with France in the West Indian sugar markets. They had colonies of their own in the region and were only too happy to fan the flames of resistance in the hopes of capitalizing on the collapse of French authority. Should France lose control of Saint-Domingue, Britain and Spain would be able to penetrate the lucrative sugar trade on the island, and even possibly wrest control of the island from the French government altogether. Upon hearing of the slave revolts convulsing the French Antilles, both states felt it was in their interest to lend their support to the slave uprisings. In 1793, the two colonial powers began intervening militarily in the conflict. They supplied rebels with arms and ingratiated themselves with insurrectionary leaders. The British even made tacit promises to liberate slaves if the island was placed under their control, flagrantly challenging French rule. With the slave rebellion threatening to become a new colonial war, the Republican government in Paris could no longer sit back and let things resolve themselves. Without immediate action, Saint-Domingue could possibly be overrun and lost forever. Assessing these realities, the convention decided to eliminate the threat. In February of 1794, the French government made a formal declaration abolishing slavery throughout all French territory. This decree not only fit with the Jacobins' own admiration for the principle of equality, it had a strategic aspect as well. Abolition intended to rally slaves to the new French Republican government, dictating that if slaves fought for France, they could be assured of their freedom. The strategy proved successful. Rebel leaders allied with the Republic, urging all former slaves to take up arms and fight under the Republican banner of liberty and equality. A new Republican army was pieced together in the colonies, made up of former slaves and Republican forces, insisting that the colonial war was now a fight for the same values as those being defended in France, namely liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Many gens de couleur resisted this motion. They may have intended to secure liberties for free blacks on the island, but they had not sought to overturn the institution of the slave regime. With Paris taking a more radical stance on the issue, the gens de couleur were now put in an unworkable situation, exacerbating the deep social and racial cleavages that ran right through colonial society. As these divisions came to the surface, Saint-Domingue was thrust into a violent civil war in which colonists, free blacks, former slaves, and foreign colonial powers all fought for control of the French colony. The collapse of authority in Saint-Domingue unleashed a series of fierce struggles that shattered the fragile colonial system on the island. The Citizenship Decree of 1794 marked the extension of civil equality into the colonies, spreading the French Revolution into the Atlantic. For the Jacobins, this development symbolized one more step in the destruction of the old regime, and a move toward the full realization of their revolutionary program. However, the spread of revolutionary ideas in the colonies raised a series of new questions that had not necessarily been anticipated in 1789. What constituted the nation? Was it just the French metropole, or was the revolution intended to transform all French society? If the revolution was to be applied to the overseas territories, what would be its implications? These new circumstances also raised another important question. Who exactly belonged to the nation, and in what capacity? As the revolution migrated into the colonies, it was evident that these questions now demanded attention. It was also evident that the revolution itself was being changed. If the struggles for liberty at home grappled with issues of social and political equality, in the colonies, these aspirations collided with the realities of racial oppression and exclusion, raising questions on the very nature of citizenship and, with it, the fundamental values of the revolution itself.